Now I want to introduce Tom Reid of Reid Consulting Group to provide you with an update on the results of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 option. We worked with Tom for many years. He's on the call and he's graciously sat through our entire meeting. But he's definitely someone that we can rely on to help us paint the picture of the lack of access. This should be a really good discussion. He's very patient when he answers my many questions every time I call him, and he's going to explain really what happened during the FCC's auction process to you better than I can. So I will stop sharing my screen and let Tom share his.
Okay. All right. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate everybody's time and attention to what is continuing to be an ongoing crucial topic for our region, which is the broadband, lack of broadband in our area. The auction progressed, and I'll brief you on that just to remind you of kind of the issues we're dealing with. One of the big issues is we've got missing infrastructure. There's been $85 billion spent, and unlike our highways, you know, we spend a lot of money on highways. It costs $10 to $20 million a mile to build them, and you've heard this from me before. And there's always some level of waste, fraud, and abuse in any big public works project like that. But we can still drive the highways. You know, most recently the Nelsonville bypass. It works. But in broadband, we've got this $85 billion that's gone out the door in the last 20 years, and the rural digital highway is missing in action. And that $85 billion comes from the Universal Service Fund administered by the FCC, created through an act of Congress, specifically to improve rural telecommunications infrastructure. Because in the rural areas with a lower population density, there needs to be a subsidy. So we've funneled $85 billion to the big carriers, and they've pretty much left us hanging. I think it's really imperative that we stop spending money poorly, or put that in a positive way. It's really imperative that we wisely invest public dollars that become available, sort of echoing some of the concerns about the CARES money. So as an analogy, since we're talking about highways already, imagine if you just stop maintaining roads for a few decades. You'd start out with monster potholes, and after a while, you'd end up with nothing but a goat path. Well, that's what's happened to our copper. The copper that is serving rural America is decrepit. It's well past end of life, much of it 50 years old or older. That ancient copper's fine. It'll do fine in providing telecommunication services, but not copper that is way beyond its end of life. It's just too decrepit. In a lot of areas, it won't support reliable telephone service, so there's no way it's going to support broadband. And then the companies have cut their staffing so much that it takes them weeks to restore services. And there have been many, many, many PUCO cases about this, hundreds and hundreds of pages of complaints just in a couple of months about the service in our service area. So really, we have a situation de facto abandonment of our region by the large telcos, and it poses a lot of life safety risks. Amesville's been kind of been my poster child in Athens County because according to all the maps, they have mobile service, they have broadband, and of course they have telephone service. And what we've learned is, no, they don't have broadband, they don't have cell phone coverage, and a lot of times their phones don't work. That's a huge life safety risk. So one of our big hopes is through the FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Big hopes in terms of solving this problem. It does draw from the Universal Service Fund, the same place that the $85 billion came from the last 20 years. It has a $20 billion budget awarded in two phases. Phase 1 was awarded in December of 2020. And this is what happened in Phase 1, decided in December. Everything in Ohio that was available for bid got picked up. So that's the good news. And everyone who bid in our area, for very small exceptions, are promising to provide gigabit services on fiber optic cables. So great news. And sincerely hope that all of these auction winners do what they've promised to do. But we've got a lot of concerns there. The area of not as much concern are these green areas. And these green areas, that's Charter Spectrum. They already have a large service footprint in the area. And if they truly intend to expand broadband to all of these households that they indicate that they are willing to serve, that's great news for our area, that Charter Spectrum may expand. We've got other groups like Mercury Wireless. These other 4 big winners that you see here, none of them currently operate in Ohio. None of them have ever done fiber to the home. They're wireless internet service providers. And so we're really concerned about their ability to execute on what they've promised to do. And you'll see Mercury Wireless as an example. They're the dark blue. They are spread out all across the lower 2/3 of the state of Ohio. So from a logistical standpoint, actually being able to build a network that connects all those little teeny areas and operate that network, provide good customer service, seems really problematic. And then you can see some even smaller little dots around different colors. Those are all different companies that, Washington County, there's that many companies that are going to serve Washington County. It's just hard to imagine that's really going to play out. Now, before people start going, hey, now wait a second, there's a lot of areas that aren't colored there that we know don't have broadband. That is absolutely true. The FCC maps we know understate the situation. I'm really confident that the areas the FCC identified don't have broadband. I'm equally confident there's a lot of other areas the FCC did not identify that do not have broadband. So this is good news in terms of potentially solving part of the problem, but there's still a lot left to do even beyond this. It covered in Ohio 192,000 households. About $840 million was the total amount that could have been awarded. We ended up with only $170 million. As I mentioned, there's at least 150,000 additional households in Ohio, most of them in southeastern Ohio, that are still without broadband. This just zooms in a little bit to show the Buckeye Hills service area in a little more detail. Monroe County, pretty concentrated by a company called Connect Everyone. So at least it's a concentration. They don't have any experience doing fiber to the home, which is a little disturbing, but at least they have a pretty big contiguous service area. Noble County, similar. Noble, Washington, Morgan, Hocking, you see all these areas where Charter Spectrum is indicating that they're going to expand dramatically, which would be great news for us. And we can see some of these other little groupings, a little bit of blue here, blue there. I have a hard time believing that's really going to be practical. So what happened, there's $840 million in the state of Ohio, about $700 million of that in southeastern Ohio, a lot of it in the Buckeye Hills territory. That was the reserve to provide gigabit services to all locations in the auction on fiber. And the reserve is the full cost of building a network like that minus the projected revenues. So according to the FCC, to provide gigabit to all those locations in Ohio, a provider would need a subsidy of $840 million. So the bidding starts, and the bidding starts at 100 and goes down. And that's 100% of the reserve, 90% of the reserve, and so forth. Then on a nationwide basis, they reach what they call the clearing round. The clearing round is when the total of all bids nationwide equals the budget. So the budget the FCC established was $16 billion. So they had $27 billion in need. They allocated $16 billion for it. So they already had to trim $11 billion from it. And so $500 million was where the clearing round happened. Nothing in Ohio was picked up at the clearing round. Bidding in Ohio was surprisingly aggressive. It got bid all the way down to 20%. So, it's great that there's so many people interested in serving Ohio, but it's kind of disturbing that it got all the way down to 20%. Now, if they can actually make a business model at that level, that's great. But our concern is they may have been just sort of a bidding frenzy and bid things below actual sustainable levels. Unfortunately, that means that's $330 million that should have come to Ohio that is not coming to Ohio. Besides is it going to be feasible for them to do what they said they were going to do, that's $330 million in construction contracts and so forth that aren't going to happen unless it all happens with private investment. And on that question of private investment, what that means is we like the FCC number, $840 million. We would probably peg it a little bit higher. Working with Buckeye Hills, we did our own little effort to see what it would cost to build fiber everywhere to test the FCC numbers. And we were pretty close with the FCC numbers. We got them to move a little bit in how they work their formula so that the reserve is higher than it would have been otherwise. So if this number is true, 840 million is what it would cost, and it got bid all the way down to 170 million, then that means these companies need to come up with $670 million in private investment to make good on what they've promised. And that's what we'll be trying to get the FCC really to look at is, do these awardees have that kind of money? Again, I'm hoping Charter Spectrum is going to do what they promised. These other smaller companies are the concern. So the timeline, they're entering due diligence now. Right about the end of January, all the people who won have to submit these due diligence documents. And then the FCC goes through a review and interview process with the recipients. So it's not too hard to get qualified to bid in an FCC auction. It's much harder than to get through due diligence. They sort of backload the process. Organizations like USDA kind of front load it. You have to provide your entire network design and pre-subscriptions and all this work to get the grant. With the FCC, you win the auction, and then you have to prove that you can do what you're intending to do. So assuming that wraps up in July, it may go longer, but let's assume it wraps up in July. That means they'll start getting monthly subsidy payments that progress through 2031. And then their deployment milestones, their first deployment milestone is at the end of year 3, when they have to show that they can serve 40% of the households in any given state. And then year 6, you're at 95%. You don't reach 100% until year 8. So it's a long time for these projects. I would really like them to compress these schedules. So the kind of open questions we have: will these winning bidders drop census blocks, for instance, non-contiguous ones? You can say, oh, it doesn't make any sense what we won. We just sort of scattershot bid on everything. Let's drop a whole mess of census blocks. They'll pay a small fine, and those census blocks will go into the phase 2 auction. Will they survive FCC due diligence? Are these companies going to be able to show that they have the technical, financial, and managerial capacity to do what they said? Are they just going to discover that, wow, they really bid this down too far and walk away altogether? And will they meet this pace? Are they just going to do the minimum pace, or are they going to do something accelerated? When I saw they bid down to 20%, I thought, oh my gosh, this can never work. I took a financial formula I created for a rural electric cooperative and adapted it to very patient capital players. So if you're a very patient investor and don't mind having massive losses for the first 5 years, you could create a business model here, because you'd have maybe 10% returns for 30 or 40 years after you get through that implementation phase. The only way that works, though, is to do it fast. They want to build this as fast as possible to get to the point where they start making money instead of losing money. So, yeah, maybe we're going to see rapid action, but time will tell. And unfortunately, it's going to be several months before we know any more information about what's going to happen. The FCC is notoriously opaque, and that lack of transparency is a big problem. So given their lack of transparency, how long is it going to take for the public to know whether these auction winners are doing what they promised to do? In 2014, the FCC gave a mess of money to the telephone companies, telling them to deploy broadband. And about 4 years into that, it was a 6-year program, about 4 years into that program, we went to the FCC to get the deployment reports. It looked like something from the NSA. It was 90% redacted. So we went to Congressman Johnson. He's very interested in the topic. Says, yeah, I'll go get this data. They gave him the same information. So the FCC considers all that data about what have they deployed, where have they spent the money, what's their project plans, all that kind of information we need to know. The FCC considers proprietary to the carriers and won't release, and the carriers wouldn't tell us either. So that lack of transparency is really a problem. If these companies are actually going to do what they promised, it's great news for our region. But are we going to have to wait till 2025 to find out? And so one of the questions is, would the public service be better served if the FCC awarded based on the quality of the proposed network instead of the low bidder? Obviously, I'm thinking that answer is yes. And then another concern for our region is, will those phase 1 awards block those areas from all other types of funding? And unfortunately, I'm afraid that is also going to be a yes. So look at Noble County, for instance. A lot of Noble County is supposed to be picked up by Charter Spectrum. If that's true, that's great news. But in the meantime, there's a desire to try to solve some of those gaps before waiting for Charter, or in the assumption that maybe Charter's not going to really do what they promised. But USDA is probably not going to fund it because Charter says they're going to deploy gigabit. House Bill 13 probably wouldn't fund it because Charter says they're going to do gigabit. So it's all going to depend on the language coming out of these different funding opportunities. But that's another big concern, is we don't know how fast things are going to happen, and we don't know if we're going to be blocked from other funding sources. Now, there's still a lot of areas in our region that will qualify, but these areas that were won at auction, we're not sure about. So got some proposed FCC advocacy pushes. One of them is that it should be a proposal process instead of an auction process, so we seek the overall best solution. And the FCC already has a mechanism for this. In the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, rather than an auction, they put out a request for proposals, and they awarded the best overall value instead of the lowest price. So they could do it. I think we should require construction of new infrastructure. This is an infrastructure problem. Our copper is completely decrepit. We need to replace that copper. You could argue a lot of different options for replacing it. Looks like fiber is the most cost-effective long-term, and given our terrain, wireless is difficult if you want to reach 100% of the area. And these space-based solutions like SpaceX, really interesting, and I think they're going to fit in providing competition in areas. They're going to fit in providing service to really remote areas. But I don't think we need to give $1 billion to Elon Musk from our own pockets to subsidize what he's doing. That this money should be spent for replacing our terrestrial networks that are much more resilient and much higher performance than what we're going to get out of SpaceX and the other low Earth orbit satellite options. And then shorten the deployment milestones. 100% by the end of year 4, I think is entirely feasible. And I don't know why they want to stretch that all the way out to 8 years. We also need to toughen the enforcement penalties related to failures to comply, failures to do what you said. So I mentioned in 2014, the FCC gave a lot of money to the telephone companies. All of them missed their deployment timelines. 100% of them missed their deployment timelines. The punishment was they got an extra year and an extra $2 billion. So that's not very strong enforcement. And I don't know how all these bidders kind of process that. It's like, well, the FCC says they're going to do all these terrible things to you if you don't do what you promised. But in reality, they see that the FCC has not been a strong enforcer. And then reforming the FCC programs overall, I think we should require transparency. This is our money that is getting spent, getting allocated. We need accounting of how that money gets spent. We need to know their project plans and their progress updates. If you don't want to make that information public, don't take the public money. It's a pretty simple equation there. We need more rapid cycling on reporting. All of the reporting the carriers do is only refreshed twice a year. It would be really helpful if that got refreshed on a monthly basis. Help us track what's actually happening and where the needs are. And then there's this problem with the Universal Service Fund. The Universal Service Fund adds a surcharge to people's telephone bills. Well, actual traditional wireline telephone services keep going down. There's less and less people subscribing to that. So there's a smaller and smaller base to fund the Universal Service Fund, but Universal Service Fund does not include broadband. So you get rid of your telephone and get a broadband connection, and maybe you use Spectrum's phone service over it. You're not paying into the USF. So we use USF money to deploy broadband, but then we don't add the USF surcharge to broadband, and I think we'll probably have a funding crisis in the Universal Service Fund. I don't think we need to create new programs. This money that will generate enough money from this program. It should be working. $85 billion over the last 20 years. We shouldn't be facing this problem, but we are. So we need to make the existing programs actually function correctly. So I'll get off my soapbox. That's my update, and cautiously optimistic about some of the areas, very concerned about others, and we'll just keep focused on it and try to hold people's feet to the fire.
Thank you, Tom. If there are questions from the committee right now for Tom, I'd encourage you to ask them while you have him on the line. They're all just thoroughly overwhelmed.
Happy to address anything, or go back through if you have questions about any of the slides. Or I was hoping I was going to be telling you all about how our rural electric cooperatives won all this money and they're going to deploy all this great broadband. Because I have great faith that our rural electric cooperatives would have done a great job with this. But it got bid down so low by these kind of mostly unknown national players. I'm not sure what's going on there.
Hey, Tom, this is Rick. I guess I'm just trying to get an idea of how heavy a lift these changes would be, like making these legislative changes. For instance, changing the auction model to the RFP model, those kinds of things. I'm just wondering, and Misty, do you know is NATO like saying, hey, getting people together and advocating for those kinds of changes, transparency, those kinds of things, or?
No, it's a good question, Rick. It's definitely a heavy lift. We're definitely also not the only ones bringing up these issues. There's a lot of concerns about what happened with RDOF, right? Right next door in the state of West Virginia, most of the money went to Frontier. Already got senators in West Virginia going, "What are you talking about? Frontier has not done well for us. Why are you just giving them more money?" So the reform of the FCC's programs, I think a lot of people see it. Whether there'll be enough political will, I don't know. Whether there'll be enough political will. You can't talk the commission into it. Commissions, I still don't quite understand why we set them up this way. Maybe, and a lot of times it's good that they're sort of immune from the politics. It's very difficult to bring political pressure on these federal commissions. Mm-hmm. The only way to fix it, I believe, is a legislative fix. And we have seen in the first COVID bill, in the CARES Act, there was $200 million set aside for telemedicine programs. It was sent to the FCC with specific guidelines of how they're supposed to use that money, and that worked out great. So they can be impacted by legislative mandate, and I think that's what it would take. Is this would need to be a legislative effort.
All right. Thanks, Tom, so much for joining and taking the time. I appreciate it. We'll basically keep in touch, I'm sure, for
All right.
the foreseeable future. I appreciate your work.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.